Don't cover him. The voice broke through the silence of the resuscitation room. He's still trying to breathe. Every doctor turned. The monitors had gone flat. Warren Ellery, billionaire founder of Ellery Biosystems, was on his knees beside his 4-year-old son, who hadn't moved in 6 minutes. The team had already stepped back. The man who spoke wasn't a physician. He was a night shift support worker, a black single father who pushed supply carts through the halls of Cedar Line Children's Hospital. He had just seen something an entire emergency room had missed, and it was about to cost him everything. If stories like this one matter to you, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, subscribe and stay with us. There's a lot more where this came from. Port Branton was the kind of city that looked better from a distance. From the highway overpass heading south, you could still see the old shipyard cranes standing against the river skyline like rusted monuments. And if the light hit right at dusk, the water turned copper, and the whole downtown looked almost alive. Up close, it was a different story. Half the storefronts on Millard Street had been vacant for years. The elementary schools ran on emergency budgets. The neighborhoods closest to the water, where the dock workers and factory hands had once raised families, had been carved up into underfunded rental blocks where the hallways smelled like damp wood and the heat never quite reached the upper floors in winter. Terrence Booker had lived in one of those buildings for 6 years. Apartment 414, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen window that faced a parking structure, and a radiator that knocked so loud through the night that Lene had learned to sleep through it before she turned 4. She was 9 now, and the knocking didn't bother either of them anymore. Some things you just absorbed until they became background noise. Terrence had learned that early, and he'd made sure his daughter learned it too, not as resignation, but as endurance. There was a difference, even if no one else in the building seemed to care about it. He worked the night shift at Cedar Line Children's Hospital, which meant he left the apartment at 10:30 every evening, walked 6 blocks to the bus stop on Renner Avenue, and arrived at the hospital's service entrance by 11:15. His official title was Clinical Support Technician, which sounded more formal than it was. In practice, it meant he moved things. He transported equipment between departments, crash carts, suction units, sterile supply bins, portable monitors. He prepped recovery rooms after procedures, disinfected treatment areas, restocked the pediatric ward's emergency cabinets, and made sure the right tools were in the right place before the right people needed them. It was work that required precision and dependability, and Terrence brought both without ever needing acknowledgement for it. What the job listings didn't say, and what nobody at Cedar Line had ever asked him about, was that Terrence Booker had spent 2 years in a respiratory therapy certification program at Port Branton Community College before he had to walk away. He'd been 29 then, working towards something moving in a direction that felt purposeful. Then his wife, Dana, had collapsed in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning from an acute respiratory episode that no one had predicted and that the paramedics had been too slow to reverse. She was gone before he could get to the hospital. Lene was 2 years old, and the direction Terrence had been moving in simply stopped. He hadn't gone back to the program. There wasn't time and there wasn't money, and after a while those two things fused into something heavier that he stopped trying to name. But he hadn't stopped learning. He'd kept every textbook from his coursework. He'd bought used copies of clinical references whenever they showed up at the secondhand shop on Delaney Street. He'd completed every free first aid and emergency response course the city offered, had sat in church basements and community centers and fire station meeting rooms to learn things that cost him nothing but time and time he carved out wherever he could find it. Lunch breaks, early mornings before Lene woke up, the long wait at the laundromat on Sunday nights. He was especially attentive to anything involving airway obstruction in children, because when Lene was 5, she had swallowed a small piece of a broken plastic figurine and gone silent without warning. No gagging, no coughing, no signal that something was wrong until her face was already changing color. Terrence had recognized the signs and cleared the obstruction himself before the ambulance arrived. The paramedic who showed up afterward said he'd done it perfectly. Terrence had nodded and said nothing, And that night after Lene was asleep, he'd sat at the kitchen table and opened every book he owned about pediatric airway emergencies and read until 3 in the morning. That was the man who pushed a supply cart through the 4th-floor corridor of Cedar Line Children's Hospital on a Thursday evening in late October, headphones around his neck, a half-eaten granola bar in his pocket, thinking about whether Lene had remembered to finish her science project. Across the city, the Ellery estate occupied 11 acres of elevated land above the western bank of the Branton River in a private residential enclave called Silver Lake Ridge. The homes there were set far back from the road behind iron gates and mature hedgerows, and the kind of wealth that lived in Silver Lake Ridge didn't announce itself. It simply assumed. Warren Ellery had built his house there 12 years ago, after Ellery Biosystems had its first major public offering, and his net worth crossed a threshold that made most conversations about money feel irrelevant. The house had 7 bedrooms, a private gym, a wine cellar his accountant said was worth more than some Port Branton residents earned in 5 years, and a pool complex at the rear of the property with underwater lighting, and a surrounding terrace large enough to host 50 guests comfortably. Warren was not a sentimental man. He was disciplined, strategically minded, and allergic to disorder. He ran his company the way he ran his personal life, with clean lines of authority and a clear understanding of who was responsible for what at any given moment. He did not tolerate incompetence, did not extend second chances without conditions, and had built a reputation in the industry as someone who valued results above relationships. Most people who worked for him respected him. Very few felt warmly toward him. Warren had made peace with that long ago. The one place his discipline failed him completely was Miles. His son was 4 years old and entirely unimpressed by anything Warren had built. Miles wanted to know why clouds moved, whether fish had feelings, and if the family's golden retriever could understand Spanish. He had a laugh that started in his belly and took over his whole face, and he had inherited somehow an instinct for warmth that Warren had never managed to cultivate in himself. Warren didn't know where it came from. He only knew that Miles was the one thing in his life he hadn't strategized into existence, hadn't optimized, hadn't controlled. And that made the boy more precious to him than anything on the balance sheet. On the evening of the accident, Warren had hosted a small private dinner at the estate for 3 colleagues and their families. 14 adults, 6 children, food and wine on the terrace, the pool lights glowing blue-white in the cooling October air. Miles had been playing near the shallow end with 2 of the other children, supervised, or so everyone believed, by the group's collective peripheral attention. It was the kind of assumption that reasonable people make at private gatherings, and it was the kind of assumption that costs everything when it fails. Miles had been chasing a foam toy that had drifted toward the center of the pool. He was 4 and fast and completely without fear of the water. He went in feet first, went under, came up once, and then didn't come up again. By the time one of the other children called out, Miles had swallowed water and inhaled a fragment of the foam toy that had broken apart in his grip. A guest who had done a lifeguard course in college pulled him from the pool. Miles was breathing in shallow, panicked gasps when he came out of the water, and then within 2 minutes he stopped. Warren didn't remember the drive to the hospital clearly. He remembered the lights, the feeling of the steering wheel under his hands, the sound of his own voice saying his son's name. What he remembered most clearly was running through the emergency entrance at Cedar Line Children's Hospital with Miles in his arms, and the absolute certainty that if he moved fast enough, if he demanded the right things from the right people loudly enough, the situation would resolve. That was how his world worked. Force of will applied correctly produced outcomes. Dr. Celeste Rowan was the senior physician on duty in the pediatric emergency unit that night, and she was good at her job in the way that people who have spent 15 years in pediatric emergency medicine become good not through brilliance alone, but through a combination of knowledge, pattern recognition, and the particular kind of stamina required to function clearly under sustained pressure. She'd seen drowning cases before. She'd seen aspiration injuries in children, near-miss cardiac events, airways compromised by foreign bodies. When Warren Ellery came through the doors with Miles unconscious in his arms, Dr. Rowan moved without hesitation. Dr. Nolan Pierce, the anesthesiologist on call, was already in the department. He was technically skilled, credentialed at 3 major institutions, and accustomed to being the most qualified person in any room that involved airway management. He intubated Miles within 90 seconds of the boy's arrival. The team administered epinephrine, ran compressions, monitored output. Everything that should have happened in the right order, performed by people who knew what they were doing. And for 11 minutes, none of it worked. The monitors told the story with their usual indifference. Miles's cardiac output weakened in increments, then stabilized at a level that was not survivable long-term, then weakened again. Dr. Rowan tried 2 additional interventions. Dr. Pierce adjusted the ventilator settings twice. The team was not negligent. They were not careless. They were doing everything within the framework of what they knew, and the framework was failing. Warren stood against the wall because they had made him stand against the wall, and he watched every second of it with the expression of a man whose entire model of how the world functioned was being dismantled in real time. He had money. He had influence. He had connections to medical boards and hospital administrators across the state. None of it was present in this room. None of it mattered in this room. The only thing that mattered was whether the small body on that table would breathe on its own again, and the answer was trending in one direction. Dr. Rowan stepped back from the table. She looked at the monitor for a long moment. Then she looked at Dr. Pierce, and something passed between them that didn't need to be spoken, the acknowledgement that they had reached the boundary of what they could do. She did not give up easily. 15 years had made her resistant to that word. But there was a point in every resuscitation where continuing became its own kind of harm, and she could feel that point arriving. Warren made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He pushed off the wall. Terrence had stopped his cart in the hallway outside the resuscitation bay because the cry coming through the door was unlike anything ambient in a hospital corridor. It wasn't clinical distress, a nurse calling for a crash cart, a monitor alarming. It was human, raw, and specific in the way that sounds are specific when they come from a person who has crossed past the point of containment. He'd heard something like it once before in the hallway of this same hospital, the night a mother was told her 7-year-old hadn't survived a car accident. He'd been 20 feet away and had felt it like a pressure change. He looked through the narrow observation window beside the resuscitation bay door. The room was fully staffed. Dr. Rowan was at the table. Dr. Pierce stood near the head of the bed. 2 nurses, monitoring equipment. Everything that should be there was there, and the small child on the table was not moving. Terrence was about to continue down the hallway when he saw it. It was a movement in the submandibular region, the soft tissue just beneath the jaw, a faint, irregular contraction that was separate from anything the ventilator was producing. Not large, not sustained, but rhythmic in a way that mechanical ventilation doesn't create on its own, because mechanical ventilation fills the lungs from the outside. And what Terrence was seeing was the musculature below the jaw firing in a pattern that only happened when a body was still trying to initiate a breath from within. It was the kind of signal that was easy to miss when you were focused on the chest on the monitor on the compressions. It was the kind of signal he had read about in a chapter on pediatric airway failure that he'd studied at his kitchen table 2 years after Lene's accident, in a used textbook that cost him $4 at the Delaney Street shop. He understood immediately what it might mean. If the airway was still partially obstructed, not by water alone, but by a secondary blockage lower in the laryngeal passage, the ventilator could be moving air correctly without that air reaching the lower lungs in sufficient volume. The body would keep trying to compensate. The chest would show limited response. The heart would weaken from hypoxia even with a tube in place. The team would read it as failure of the heart, when the actual failure was further up the column. Terrence stood with his hand on the cart and thought about what it would cost him to open that door. He thought about Lene, about the rent, about the look on his supervisor's face the last time he'd been 3 minutes late clocking in. He thought about 6 years of doing his job quietly and well, of never being the person in the room who made things complicated. He thought about how he looked to the people inside that room, his uniform, his cart, the absence of any credential that would make a single person in there inclined to listen to him. He knew exactly how the moment would land. He'd navigated variations of it his entire adult life. Then he watched Dr. Rowan take a step back from the table, and he watched her look at Dr. Pierce, and he understood what that look meant because he'd been in this building long enough to know what it looked like when a team was preparing to stop. Terrence opened the door. The room reacted the way rooms react when someone unexpected enters during a critical procedure. A sharp shift in attention, a collective recalibration. Dr. Pierce turned first, and his expression went immediately to the particular kind of authority that people with institutional power deploy when boundaries are being crossed. "You need to leave," Dr. Pierce said. "Right now. This is an active treatment area." Terrence didn't move away from the door. He kept his voice level and directed it at Dr. Rowan, because in the few seconds he'd had to assess the room, she had struck him as the person most likely to hear something before deciding what to do with it. "I think there's a secondary obstruction below the tube," Terrence said. "The jaw movement isn't from the vent. He's still trying to initiate. If something's sitting under the epiglottis, the air isn't getting deep enough." Warren was across the room in 3 steps. He grabbed Terrence's collar with both hands, and his face was the face of a man who had nothing left to lose, and every reason to direct that feeling at the nearest available target. "Who are you?" Warren demanded. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" Terrence looked directly at Warren Ellery, at the suit jacket, the open collar, the expensive watch, the expression of a man who had been powerful for so long that powerlessness had become physically unbearable. He didn't pull away. He held eye contact and said without raising his voice, "I'm telling you, your son's body is still fighting. I'm asking them to check one more time." Then Terrence did something that no one in the room expected, and that he couldn't have fully explained in clinical terms, but that came from a place in him that existed before any textbook, before the certification program, before the library books, before any of it. He turned toward the table and he leaned close to Miles, and he spoke quietly and directly near the boy's ear. "Hey, I need you to try one more time. Just one more breath. You can do it." The words had no medical standing, and Terrence knew that. But he had sat at the edge of his daughter's bed when she was 5 years old and not breathing, and he had spoken to her in exactly that voice, and she had responded in a way that neither of them could explain. He didn't know if Miles could hear anything in the state he was in. He only knew that silence felt like surrender, and he wasn't willing to surrender on behalf of a child who was still, even now, sending signals that his body had not given up. 1 second passed, and in the soft tissue beneath Miles Ellery's jaw, there was a contraction faint, unmistakable. And this time, Dr. Rowan saw it too. Dr. Celeste Rowan had seen a lot of things in 15 years of pediatric emergency medicine that she couldn't fully account for afterward, instincts that proved correct without a clear clinical basis, observations that arrived ahead of their explanation. She was not a mystical person. She believed in evidence and process and the accumulated weight of peer-reviewed research. But she also believed in the particular intelligence that developed in people who spent enough time paying close attention to the same category of problem, regardless of where or how they'd acquired that attention. She looked at the contraction beneath Miles's jaw, and then she looked at Terrence Booker at the steadiness in his face, the absence of panic, the quality of his certainty. And something in her clinical mind shifted a few degrees. Dr. Pierce stepped forward. "Celeste, this man is not authorized to be in here. Whatever he thinks he saw." "Nolan." Dr. Rowan's voice was quiet, but it cut the sentence off cleanly. She moved to the head of the bed and looked at Miles's throat with the focused attention of someone who was no longer operating on assumption. The ventilator was cycling. The tube placement was correct by every standard measure. And yet the submandibular tissue was doing something that a correctly ventilated patient with no remaining obstruction should not be doing. Dr. Pierce crossed his arms. "The airway is clear. I placed that tube myself." "I know you did," Dr. Rowan said. She reached for a smaller suction catheter from the tray, a pediatric neonatal size, narrower than the one they'd used during the initial intubation. "I'm going to take a different angle. Just once." The room was still. Warren Ellery had released Terrence's collar and taken a step back, but he hadn't moved far. He stood with his arms at his sides and his hands closed, watching Dr. Rowan with the compressed attention of a man who had placed everything he had on a single outcome and was not breathing while he waited for it. One of the nurses exchanged a glance with the other. Neither spoke. Dr. Pierce said nothing further, but the tension across his shoulders was visible from across the room. Terrence stood near the door. He had not moved closer to the table. He had no intention of inserting himself into the procedure that was not his place and had never been his claim. His only claim had been the observation, and he'd made it. What happened now belonged to Dr. Rowan, and to whatever the next 60 seconds chose to reveal. She adjusted the angle of Miles's head by a small degree, tilting the boy's chin with practiced care, then passed the catheter along the lateral wall of the laryngeal passage rather than straight down the midline. It was not an unusual technique. It was the kind of variation that required someone to decide it was worth trying, and sometimes that decision came down to a half-second of willingness that either arrived or it didn't. The catheter met resistance at a depth that shouldn't have had resistance. Dr. Rowan applied suction. There was a sound, brief, low, organic, and then a dense plug of mucus thickened by pool water and the body's inflammatory response separated from the laryngeal wall, carrying with it a fragment of soft foam no larger than a child's thumbnail. The catheter brought it up and out, and the obstruction that had been sitting below the tube's reach, diverting enough airflow to make the difference between adequate ventilation and slow systemic collapse, was gone. For one full second, nothing changed. Then Miles's chest moved. It was not a deep breath, it was not dramatic. It was a small, reflexive, effortful contraction of the diaphragm, the body taking over the moment the path was clear, and it produced a sound somewhere between a cough and a gasp that was so faint the monitor alarm almost covered it. Almost. The first tone from the cardiac monitor came 4 seconds later. Every person in the room heard it. Dr. Rowan was already moving, adjusting ventilator settings, calling for medication adjustments, her hands precise and her voice controlled in the way that it was controlled when things were moving in the right direction and she needed the room to move with her. The second tone followed, then a third. The waveform on the screen, which had been a slow, weakening crawl, began to reorganize itself into something that looked incrementally and then unmistakably like a viable rhythm. Warren Ellery sat down on the floor. He didn't choose to. His legs simply stopped holding him. He put his hands over his face, and the sound he made was not a word and was not crying exactly. It was something more fundamental than either the sound of a man's entire framework of control dissolving at once, leaving only the raw fact of his son's heartbeat in a room that had been preparing to go quiet. Terrence watched from the door. He didn't move to the center of the room, didn't say anything, didn't mark the moment in any visible way. He stood there with his hands still on the doorframe and felt the thing inside his chest that he'd only felt once before, on the floor of his kitchen when Lene had coughed the fragment of plastic figurine out of her throat and started screaming from the shock of it. And he had understood in that moment that screaming meant air, and air meant she was going to be all right. He picked up his supply cart from the hallway and he walked back to work. Miles Ellery was transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit 40 minutes after the resuscitation bay had gone from preparing a death to managing a recovery. Dr. Rowan wrote her notes with the careful precision of someone who understood that every word she committed to the record would matter later. She noted the secondary obstruction, the catheter angle, the foam fragment. She noted the sequence of events accurately. She did not yet note in any official capacity the name of the person who had identified the problem because she was still processing exactly what that notation would mean and who would read it and what it would set in motion. Dr. Pierce left the department without speaking to anyone on his way out. He walked to the physician's lounge, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window for a long time. He was a man who had built his professional life on precision, on the belief that training and expertise applied correctly produced the best possible outcomes. That belief was still intact in its broad form, but precision, he was discovering, had a shadow, the assumption that expertise made other forms of attention unnecessary. He hadn't examined that assumption before tonight. He was examining it now. By the following morning, 3 members of Cedar Line Children's Hospital's administrative leadership had been briefed on what had happened. The briefing was factual and thorough and was received with the particular tension that institutional leaders display when accurate information presents a problem that accurate information alone cannot solve. Warren Ellery's name was in the incident report. His son's name was in the incident report. The sequence of the resuscitation was in the report, and in the margin of the preliminary documentation in handwriting that would later be transcribed into formal minutes, someone had added a question that no one at that table wanted to answer directly. Who was the man who entered the treatment bay, and how did he know what the attending physician had missed? Terrence was called into a meeting at 8:15 that morning before his overnight shift had officially ended. He had been about to clock out. He had been thinking about stopping at the bakery on Renner Avenue to bring Lene a cinnamon roll before she left for school. Instead, he followed a department coordinator down a service hallway to a small conference room near administration, where 3 people were already seated at a table, the hospital's director of clinical operations, a woman named Sandra Briggs, whose expression carried the practiced neutrality of someone who spent most of her professional life managing situations that required her to say careful things. A risk management officer whose name Terrence was given but immediately forgot. And a man in a gray suit who introduced himself only as representing the hospital's legal interests. There was no coffee on the table. There was no chair pulled out for him when he arrived. These were small things, and Terrence noticed them in the way that people who have spent their lives reading the temperature of rooms noticed them as information, not grievance. Sandra Briggs asked him to describe his actions the previous evening in his own words. Terrence described them. He was honest and precise and did not embellish. He explained what he had observed through the window, what it had indicated to him based on his knowledge of pediatric airway physiology, and what he had communicated to Dr. Rowan. He did not claim credit for the procedure. He did not characterize what he had done as anything other than what it was, an observation, communicated to the physician who had the authority and skill to act on it. The risk management officer asked where Terrence had acquired his knowledge of laryngeal anatomy and pediatric obstruction patterns. Terrence explained about the certification program, about the textbooks, about the courses, about Lene. He spoke without apology and without performance. Sandra Briggs said carefully that the hospital had significant concern about unauthorized personnel entering active treatment areas regardless of outcome. She said that the liability implications of Terrence's actions were not straightforward. She said that the hospital would need to conduct a full review before any determination could be made about his continued employment. The man in the gray suit said nothing at all during the meeting, which Terrence understood to be its own kind of communication. When Terrence left the conference room, his keycard no longer opened the service entrance. Dr. Pierce spoke to 2 colleagues over the following 2 days, and what he said in those conversations was technically accurate and strategically incomplete in the way that technically accurate statements can be. He said that the resuscitation team had been actively managing Miles Ellery's case and that a support staff member had entered the room during a critical moment. He said the team had continued their assessment and identified an additional obstruction. He did not say that the team had been preparing to stop. He did not say that the obstruction had been identified in direct response to what Terrence had pointed out. Both of those omissions were in their way a kind of verdict, not about medicine, but about what Dr. Pierce believed the record needed to protect. The story that began circulating in the hospital in the days that followed was not a lie. It was a version. And versions Terrence had learned had a way of hardening into facts when no one with institutional standing was willing to challenge them. 2 of his colleagues on the overnight support team stopped meeting his eyes in the break room. A charge nurse he'd worked alongside for 3 years offered him a stiff, obligatory smile in the hallway and found somewhere else to be. The building itself seemed to close around him in the particular way that workplaces close around someone who has become a problem, not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of careful, protective distance that communicated something his supervisor's voicemail hadn't said outright. The voicemail arrived on a Thursday. Suspension pending review effective immediately pending investigation into the breach of clinical area protocols. The language was formal and thorough and gave nothing away. Terrence listened to it standing in his kitchen, still in his jacket, the door behind him not yet closed. He listened to it twice, then set the phone on the counter and stood there looking at the window that faced the parking structure. His landlord texted that same afternoon about the November rent, which was 12 days out, and which Terrence had been planning to cover with this week's check. The suspension was unpaid. When Lene came home from school that evening, she set her backpack down and went to the kitchen the way she always did, looking for something to eat. She found Terrence sitting at the table with his badge, the deactivated one in front of him, and something in the quality of his stillness made her stop in the doorway. She was 9 years old and had been reading her father's silences since she was old enough to understand that the silences told you more than the words. "A kid at school said you got fired," she said. "She said her mom told her you got in trouble at the hospital for messing with a patient." Terrence looked at his daughter for a long moment. He thought about how to explain the distance between what had happened and what that description contained. He thought about all the versions of the explanation he could give her, the one that was accurate, the one that was protective, the one that was simple enough for a 9-year-old and honest enough to not be a lie. "I saw something that could help a little boy," he said, "and I said something about it, and some people didn't like that I said it." Lene pulled a chair out across from him and sat down. She had Dana's eyes, and sometimes the directness in them caught Terrence off guard even after all these years. "Did it help him?" she asked. Terrence said, "Yeah, it did." Lene looked at the badge on the table, then back at her father. She didn't say anything else. She just nodded once in a way that struck Terrence as carrying more dignity than most of the conversations he'd had with adults in the past 48 hours, and then she got up and went to find something to eat. He sat at the table for a long time after that, and the badge sat in front of him, and he thought about how to explain to his daughter or to himself that doing the right thing and being protected from its consequences were not the same thing, and had never been the same thing. Understanding that difference didn't make it hurt any less, but it did make it bearable. Because the alternative, staying in that hallway, keeping his hand on that cart, was something he knew, with complete certainty he would never have been able to live with. 3 days after the resuscitation, Miles Ellery opened his eyes with full awareness for the first time since the accident. The recovery had been gradual, incremental improvements in neurological response, oxygen saturation, stabilizing the ventilator, being stepped down in stages, and Dr. Rowan had been cautiously optimistic while refusing to make promises. When Miles finally surfaced with real clarity, looking around the room with the alert, slightly indignant expression of a 4-year-old who had been inconvenienced and wanted everyone to know about it. Warren had to leave the room for several minutes because he couldn't manage his face. When he came back, Miles was looking at the ceiling and moving his fingers against the blanket. Warren sat beside him and held his hand without speaking, which was not something he was good at, but which the moment required. After a while, Miles turned his head and looked at his father. His voice was rough from the tube and very small. "Where's the man?" he asked. Warren asked him which man he meant. Miles thought about it with the seriousness that 4-year-olds bring to questions they consider important. "The one who talked to me," he said. "He told me to keep trying." He couldn't describe the man's face. He said he couldn't really see anything, only that there had been a voice, low and steady, close to him, in a way that it felt like being found. Warren understood that a 4-year-old's memory of the space between consciousness and unconsciousness was not reliable evidence of anything. But he also understood that his son had surfaced from 3 days in the ICU carrying exactly one specific impression, and that impression had a name. Warren told his son to rest. He sat with Miles until the boy fell asleep, and then he stood up and walked out to the nurse's station and asked to speak to whoever handled security footage for the pediatric emergency unit. He watched the corridor recording first. He saw Terrence stop the cart. He saw him look through the window. He watched the quality of the man's attention, the stillness of it, the way his focus narrowed and held, and he recognized in it something he associated with his best engineers and analysts, people whose minds moved quickly but whose bodies went quiet when they were working. Then he watched Terrence open the door. The audio recording from inside the resuscitation bay was clearer than Warren had expected. He heard Dr. Pierce tell Terrence to leave. He heard Terrence address Dr. Rowan directly, calmly, specifically. He heard Warren's own voice ragged and cracked, demanding to know who this man was. He heard Terrence say without hesitation that the boy's body was still fighting, and he was asking them to check one more time. And then he heard something that the chaos of the room had prevented him from registering fully in the moment. Terrence's voice, low and steady, speaking directly to Miles. He heard the exact words. "One more breath. Just one more. You can do it." Warren listened to the recording twice. Then he sat in the small security office with the footage paused on an image of Terrence pushing his cart back down the hallway, unhurried, unrewarded, asking for nothing. And he understood several things at once. He understood that this man had come into a room where no one wanted him, had said something no one wanted to hear, had spoken to his son at the edge of what medicine could reach, and had then walked away without waiting to be thanked. He understood that the hospital had since suspended this man. He understood that he had been advised by his own attorney to stay quiet about the specifics of what had happened. And he understood with a clarity that surprised him, given how rarely clarity of this kind arrived in his professional life, that following that advice would make him complicit in something he did not want his name attached to. Warren Ellery had built a career on knowing when a situation required him to act against the advice he was being given. He picked up his phone and called his assistant and told her to arrange a meeting with Cedar Line Children's Hospital's board of directors. All of them, within the week. The meeting was held on a Monday morning in the hospital's main boardroom on the 6th floor. A room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the river, and a long oak table that had been polished so many times it reflected the ceiling lights like still water. It was the kind of room designed to project institutional authority, and under normal circumstances, it succeeded. On this particular Monday, Warren Ellery was already seated at the far end of the table when the board members arrived, which was not how these meetings were supposed to begin, and which established the temperature of the room before a single word was spoken. There were 9 people present, 4 members of the hospital's board of directors, Sandra Briggs, the director of clinical operations, the man in the gray suit from legal, Philip Crane, Dr. Celeste Rowan, Dr. Nolan Pierce, and Terrence Booker, who had been called that morning and told to come in at 9, and who had arrived in the same jacket he wore to every important occasion he'd faced in the past 6 years, the one he'd bought for Dana's funeral and had kept clean ever since, because he never knew when he'd need it again. Terrence sat at the side of the table, not at either end. He set his hands in his lap and looked at the room with the same quality of attention he'd brought to the window outside the resuscitation bay 3 weeks earlier. He noticed that Philip Crane had a legal pad in front of him and had already written several lines on it, which meant the hospital's position had been prepared in advance. He noticed that Dr. Pierce had chosen a seat as far from him as the table allowed. He noticed that Dr. Rowan had placed herself at a position that was neither adjacent to administration nor adjacent to Terrence, which he read as the spatial expression of a person who had not yet decided where she stood and was being honest about that. Warren opened without preamble. He thanked no one for coming, which was either rudeness or efficiency, depending on your perspective, and said that he had requested the meeting because he intended to understand clearly and completely why the man who had identified the obstruction in his son's airway had been suspended from his job, rather than acknowledged for what he'd done. He said this without raising his voice and without the word demand anywhere in the sentence, which made it somehow more unambiguous than if he had. Sandra Briggs said carefully that the hospital took the clinical outcome very seriously and had great respect for everyone involved in Miles's care. She said that the review process was standard procedure following any incident involving an unauthorized individual in an active treatment area, and that no final determination had been made regarding Terrence's employment. Warren said he had listened to the audio recording from the resuscitation bay. He said he would like, if no one objected, to play a portion of it now. He did not wait to see if anyone objected. The recording came through the small speaker Warren placed on the table, and the room heard what Warren had heard in the security office. Dr. Pierce's voice instructing Terrence to leave, Terrence's measured description of the secondary obstruction, and then, beneath it all, the quiet voice speaking to a 4-year-old boy at the edge of what medicine could offer. The recording ended. The room was still in the way that rooms are still when the people in them are recalculating. Dr. Pierce spoke first. He said that his position had been consistent with clinical protocol. He said that unauthorized presence in a resuscitation environment created liability exposure and could compromise the team's focus at a critical moment. He said that Terrence's observation had been one input among several, and that Dr. Rowan had made the final clinical decision independently, as was appropriate. His voice had the structure of someone who had rehearsed the argument and believed it, and there was enough truth embedded in it to make it difficult to dismiss outright. Warren did not argue. He reached into the folder in front of him and slid a single printed page to the center of the table. It was the hospital's own incident timeline, pulled from the preliminary report with 2 lines highlighted. The first was the timestamp of Dr. Rowan's final intervention before she had stepped back from the table. The second was the timestamp of Terrence's entry into the room. The gap between them was less than 30 seconds. He said nothing else. He let the numbers sit. Dr. Pierce looked at the page. He looked at it for long enough that the quality of his silence began to change, to shift from the silence of someone composing a counter-argument to the silence of someone who has run out of counter-arguments and is now alone with what remains. He was a precise man. He had been in that room. He knew what 30 seconds meant, and he knew what it meant that he had spent those 30 seconds trying to remove the only person who had seen the problem clearly. He had been sitting with this knowledge for 3 weeks in the physician's lounge, and in his car, and in the early hours of the morning when sleep didn't come. He had constructed versions of the event that were accurate enough to defend, but not honest enough to sit comfortably with. He was tired of the versions. He looked up from the page, and for the first time in the meeting, his eyes moved to Terrence directly. "I should have listened," Dr. Pierce said. The words came out without the rehearsed quality of everything he'd said before them. "I assessed the situation, and I decided I already knew what it contained. I dismissed what you said because of who you were in that room. Not what you said, who you were." He held Terrence's gaze steadily, the way a person does when they have decided that honesty at this point is the only thing they have left to offer. "I don't have a better explanation than that." The honesty of it was jarring in a way that a more elaborate apology would not have been. Terrence held Dr. Pierce's gaze and didn't fill the space with reassurance or deflection. He nodded once, not absolution, not warmth, but acknowledgement. The kind that passes between 2 people when one of them has finally said the true thing, and both of them know it. Terrence spoke next. He had thought about what he wanted to say in this room, and he had decided sometime in the early hours of that morning, while Lene was asleep and the apartment was quiet, that he was going to say it plainly and without architecture. He didn't want to construct an argument. He wanted to describe what had happened. He said that he hadn't entered the resuscitation bay to prove anything or to challenge anyone's authority. He said he'd worked in that building for 6 years and had never once done anything that wasn't within his assigned role, and that he was aware of what his assigned role was. He said that what he saw through that window was a signal he recognized from years of studying something that had become personal to him long before it became academic. He said he understood that the people in that room were trained clinicians with knowledge that far exceeded his own, and that he would never claim otherwise. But he said there was a difference between expertise and attention, and that attention didn't require a credential. It required only the willingness to look carefully and keep looking after other people had looked away. He said he was not asking for an apology from anyone in the room. He was asking for 2 things. He was asking for his job back, and he was asking that whatever went into the official record about that evening reflected what had actually happened, not a version of it, but the actual sequence, including his name and his role in it. He said this not because he needed recognition, but because the truth of what had happened deserved to exist as fact and not as subtext. He said it for the next person who might stand outside a room with something important to say and decide it wasn't worth the cost of saying it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Dr. Rowan set both hands flat on the table and spoke. She said that she had been thinking about the night of Miles Ellery's resuscitation every day since it happened. She said she had reviewed her own decisions, the team's decisions, the sequence and the timing, with the rigor she applied to every case that didn't end the way it could have. She said she was prepared to state for the official record that Terrence Booker had identified a specific clinical finding that the team had not identified, had communicated it clearly and accurately under conditions that would have discouraged most people from speaking at all, and that the action taken in response to his observation had directly contributed to a positive outcome. She said she would put her name on that statement in whatever form the hospital required. Philip Crane wrote something on his legal pad. Sandra Briggs looked at the window. Warren waited until the room had settled and then said with the directness of a man who had made significant decisions in rooms like this his entire adult life, that he wanted Terrence's suspension lifted effective immediately and his employment record cleared of any reference to unauthorized conduct. He said he wanted the official incident documentation amended to reflect Dr. Rowan's statement accurately and completely. He said he wanted this done not as a favor to him, and not because of what his name was worth to the hospital's donor relationships, but because it was the correct thing to do. And if the hospital's leadership needed his name attached to the correct thing in order to do it, then they could have his name. He also said something that no one in the room had been expecting. He said that he intended to fund, through Ellery Biosystems' Community Health Division, a program he was calling the Second Breath Initiative, a training program in pediatric airway emergency response aimed at non-clinical populations, parents, teachers, school staff, transit workers, and anyone else who spent significant time with children and might one day find themselves in a position where knowing what Terrence knew could make the same difference it had made 3 weeks ago. He said he was asking Terrence when he was ready to help design it. This was not, Warren knew, a redemption gesture. He had no interest in framing it that way. It was a practical response to a gap that the events of that night had made visible, a gap between what trained clinicians knew and what the people closest to children in everyday life were equipped to recognize. Filling that gap was useful, regardless of how anyone in this room felt about the circumstances that had revealed it. Warren Ellery had always been better at utility than at sentiment, and for once utility and the right thing happened to point in the same direction. The paperwork restoring Terrence's employment was completed by the end of that week. The amended incident report was filed and signed by Dr. Rowan, and countersigned by 2 members of the board. The story that emerged in the press was accurate and did not require any version of events that anyone in that boardroom had needed to manufacture. Dr. Pierce submitted a proposal to the hospital's education committee 3 weeks later, outlining a new module for the internal clinical training program, a session on situational awareness and the psychology of expertise, specifically addressing the ways in which professional confidence could narrow perception at critical moments. He proposed to teach the session himself. The committee approved it. No one made a speech about it. That was how Dr. Pierce preferred it. Some forms of accountability were quieter than others, and they were not less real for being quiet. Lene was in the middle of a math worksheet when Terrence came home and told her he was going back to work. She looked up from the paper, asked if that meant they were keeping the apartment, and when he said yes, she said, "Good," because she was tired of him reorganizing the kitchen cabinets. Terrence laughed for the first time in 3 weeks, a real laugh, from somewhere low in his chest, and the sound of it moved through the apartment the way the radiator knocked familiar and not unwelcome and present. Miles Ellery was discharged from Cedar Line Children's Hospital on a Friday afternoon, 12 days after the night his heart had produced its first tentative tone on the monitor. He walked out of the building on his own feet, holding Warren's hand, wearing a sweatshirt with a cartoon excavator on it that a nurse had given him because it was better than the hospital gown. He had been told, in age-appropriate terms, that he had been very sick and that the doctors had helped him get better. And he had accepted this with the equanimity of a 4-year-old for whom every day already contained multiple inexplicable events. Warren had arranged for Terrence to come to the hospital before the discharge, and they met in the family consultation room on the 4th floor. A small, plainly furnished space that smelled like industrial carpet and hand sanitizer and was designed for difficult conversations, which made it a slightly strange setting for this one. When Miles saw Terrence come through the door, he looked at him with the particular focus of a child trying to match a face to a feeling he'd been carrying for days. Something in the recognition settled slowly, and Miles said, "You're the one who talked to me." Terrence crouched down to Miles's level and said that he was. Miles thought about this with the gravity he brought to important matters. Then he went to the corner of the room where his small bag of belongings sat, and he pulled from it a toy ambulance, red and white, with a working siren button that Warren had already heard 400 times in the past week, and he held it out to Terrence with both hands. Terrence looked at the toy in Miles's hands for a moment, and then at the boy's face, and felt something come loose in his chest that he hadn't realized had been held tight since the night Dana died. Some wire of accumulated grief and effort and quiet, unwitnessed sacrifice that had been keeping him upright for years, and that in this moment he no longer needed to hold so hard. He took the ambulance. He said thank you. And then, because he was a man who had learned to sit with emotion without rushing through it, he stayed crouched at eye level with Miles for a few seconds longer and looked at the boy's face, the alive face of a child who had been 4 days from a birthday he almost didn't reach, and let the fact of it settle into him fully. Warren watched from across the room. He had been advised by smart people over the course of his career that the most important skill a person in his position could develop was the ability to separate what money made possible from what money made him believe was the same as possible. He had ignored that advice for years, and it had cost him very little until the night it had nearly cost him everything. He wasn't sure he would have remembered it on his own. He was certain he would not have remembered it without a man in worn shoes standing in a doorway and refusing to walk away. 2 years later, Port Branton's first Second Breath Initiative community training session was held in the gymnasium of Jefferson Park Elementary School, 8 blocks from Terrence's apartment on Renner Avenue. The room held 63 people, parents, teachers, a crossing guard named Harold, who had been trying to find a CPR course that fit his schedule for 3 years, 2 school bus drivers, a pair of daycare workers from the West Side neighborhood, and a dozen others who had seen the flyer at the library or the community center or the laundromat on Delaney Street. Terrence stood at the front of the room. He was 39 years old and held a respiratory therapy certification he had completed the previous spring, funded by the grant Warren had arranged through Ellery Biosystems. Before he started, he set 2 things on the table beside him. The first was his old respiratory therapy textbook from the community college program, the one he'd carried with him from apartment to apartment for 10 years, its cover soft with handling, its margins dense with pencil notes in his own handwriting. The second was the toy ambulance Miles had given him in the consultation room on the 4th floor, its red paint slightly scuffed from 2 years on a shelf in a small apartment where a 9-year-old occasionally relocated things without explanation. Nobody asked about the objects. Everybody understood them. In the back row, Warren sat with Miles beside him. Miles was 6 now and had been told in fuller terms the story of what had happened when he was 4, and had listened to it with the solemnity of a child beginning to understand that some things in his life were permanent in the good direction. Dr. Pierce sat 3 seats away from Warren, attending as a regular participant rather than a clinical observer, which had been his own decision and which Terrence had made no comment about when he saw him come through the door. Lene Booker was in the 2nd row. She was 11 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of paying close attention to rooms. She watched Terrence stand at the front of that gymnasium and begin to speak, and the expression on her face was not the wide-eyed pride of a child watching a parent perform. It was quieter than that. It was the look of someone who had known all along. Terrence looked out at the room at the crossing guard who'd been waiting 3 years for this, at the daycare workers, at the parents who had come on a weeknight because they wanted to know what to do if the worst arrived before the ambulance did. And he thought about the distance between that corridor window and this gymnasium, and about all the steps in between that had felt at the time like loss. He understood now that they hadn't been. They had been the route. He set his hand on the model of a child's airway that the program had provided, and he said, "The most important thing I'm going to teach you today is how to stay in the room when everything in you wants to walk away. That's what saves lives. Not the technique alone, the willingness to stay." Then he began. There's a version of this story where Terrence Booker keeps walking down that hallway, where he keeps his hand on the cart, clocks out at the end of his shift, and goes home to Lene without anyone ever knowing what he saw. That version is quieter. It costs him nothing. And somewhere in Port Branton, Warren Ellery is a man who never had to reckon with the limits of what money can buy because he never had to face the thing money couldn't fix. The version that actually happened cost Terrence almost everything before it gave him something back. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the person standing outside the room, wondering whether what you have to say is worth the risk of saying it, we'd love for you to stay with us too. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the most important thing we can do for another person is put the right story in front of them at the right time. That's what Terrence did in his own way on a Thursday night in October. He stayed in the room,